we spoke to Manolo de los Santos, who has been on the ground in Cuba, to hear some of his perspective on how the island is dealing with the fuel blockade, who is pushing this policy within the Trump administration to, further strangle Cuba, and what the American people think of this policy. So let's hear that interview. So, to talk about the situation in Cuba, how people are responding on the ground, and what is really behind the US threats, we're very happy to be joined by Manolo de los Santos, Executive Director of the People's Forum. Manolo, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Zoe, for having me again.
Great, Manolo. Well, a lot has happened in the 3 months since the U.S. imposed this fuel blockade essentially on Cuba. You were just there. Can you first talk a little bit about how people are dealing with this blockade? How does it impact daily life? And what is kind of the spirit of the people in Cuba right now?
Yeah, I got back from Cuba just a few days ago, and the weight, the crushing weight of the Trump fuel blockade can very much still be felt everywhere I went in the city of Havana. From the reality, obviously, of transportation in the city, public transportation continues to be, I would say, quite difficult, if not almost null. Um, but there are other aspects of life that sometimes are less obvious to the foreign eye, but that are clearly impacting the daily life of Cubans. Starting with, for example, without fuel, which means there's less electricity, it really impacts the distribution of water in the city. So for millions of people in cities across Cuba, not just in Havana, access to water right now is being severely limited and often comes at odd hours of the day, which means that, in a sense, people's sort of biological rhythms have to change in order to sort of, whenever there is electricity, meaning there is water available, everything has to sort of be done around that time, whether it's from personal hygiene to cooking. Food continues to be a major challenge as more food continues to have to be brought from the countryside into the cities. There's been a major plan in cities across Cuba now to produce more food locally, meaning to even like distribute the production of food, particularly to each municipality. But even that faces severe challenges because of the lack of supplies um, that are associated with the availability of fuel. And I think there's just so many different aspects that are just proving the genocidal character of the fuel blockade. But despite that, everywhere I went, actually, I was quite amazed that still, or in fact, there's a deeper sense of resistance among the Cuban people. I would say even across the spectrum, not just of the people who necessarily sympathize with the Cuban government or are in solidarity or defend socialism, but over across the board in society, I would say that there was a deep sense of Trump is doing this to us. This is unconscionable. This is truly an attempt to take over our country, and we cannot allow that. And that was basically said to me in so many different ways across every conversation I had while I was in Cuba.
Well, Manolo, obviously you've been writing a lot about the situation. You are a Cuba expert. You've been covering U.S.-Cuba relations for many years. I think it's interesting in these last couple of months, in addition to the fuel blockade, we have seen increased kind of rhetorical threats coming from the Trump administration, saying that Cuba's next. There hasn't been a ton of, you know, explanation or detailing of what that means. But I'm wondering if you can talk about these latest threats from the Trump administration. What are they actually threatening? And what does this mean for the Cuban people and the Cuban revolution?
Well, I feel that, and this is my personal opinion, that a lot of these threats coming from the White House, from Trump personally, from U.S. officials, the constant sort of threat of ultimatums. If you don't do this within this amount of time, if you don't agree to this or that, is a desperate response to the resolve of the Cuban people. The fact that across the board, there's a sense of unity across the country, but also that there's a sense of unity in the leadership of the country. Um, I think in every public appearance that Cuban officials have made, from vice foreign ministers, foreign minister himself, the president on multiple occasions, even speaking to the American press, have made it very clear their willingness to negotiate and be in dialogue with the US, and at the same time, uh, strong resolve that they're not going to negotiate the sovereignty of their country. They're not going to negotiate the independence of their country. They're not going to negotiate their political system, as is, I would say, quite normal in diplomatic relations between any set of countries. So I think, for example, Trump saying this recently, or this past weekend, that there's going to be a new dawn for Cuba, is, I sense, to me, a real desperation among the Trump administration officials, being it is as they're stuck in Iran. They're unable to actually affirm their so-called victory when it was in fact a defeat versus Iran. They cannot actually articulate a real approach to what it means to actually take over Cuba. And they've had to, I think, counter, because I think it's been visible to so many of us, or anyone who's, just keenly observing Cuba, that the Cuban people have no plans or desire to simply roll over and hand themselves over to masters in the US.
Yeah, well, I think another interesting aspect in this latest US attack on Cuba and this string of different measures that the US is imposing on the island is it seems that there's kind of a lack of discourse in the media, and kind of it seems that the Trump administration has sort of abandoned an attempt to convince the US society that this is important or necessary, or even really present their argument of why they're doing this. Wondering if you can talk a little bit about how people in the United States actually see what's happening in Cuba, and where sentiments lie in terms of views on US policy towards Cuba.
Well, I think people in the United States, more than just a question of Cuba itself, have had to live in the last few months this just increased wave of US hyperimperialism, of increased militarism, of just a brutal and genocidal and violent response by the United States to the world's affairs. The fact that the US kidnaps, captures a president, brings him to trial in the United States with no legitimacy, with no credibility to do so, in total violation of international law, that they then unprovoked attacked the country of Iran and basically massacre schoolgirls in broad daylight, and wage this senseless, brutal war against the people of Iran, and that they're basically now threatening the people of Cuba with the same, really says something about where the state of the consciousness and the public opinion are in the United States. I think people are tired of it. People obviously don't see how the American people could possibly benefit from this hypermilitarism. I think it's clear that, and I say clear because it's reflected in multiple polls that we've seen over the last few weeks, that there is no agreement in American society. There's no consensus. There's no support for the type of violent policies of the Trump administration towards Cuba. I think people in the US have never really seen Cuba as a threat. No one, is up late at night thinking about how Cuba is going to attack the US. That's a figment of Marco Rubio's imagination. And at this point, it also becomes clear, and I think it was a powerful intervention made by the Cuban president, speaking to meet the press and like directly talking to the American people. This could be resolved by talking to each other in a serious and honest way. Yet most Americans, when they hear that, must know that we all know that it's the US president, Donald Trump, who cannot ever engage in an honest and meaningful way. He is a pathological liar. He is an irrational egomaniac, and is someone who ultimately uses negotiations actually as a ploy to give himself time to wage attacks on other countries. So I think a lot of it has been laid bare to the American people, and that changes, I think, a lot of the dynamics and puts real constraints on what the Trump administration is actually capable of doing at this point.
And you mentioned one name, Marco Rubio, but who is behind this hawkish policy towards Cuba? And in the end, what are they trying to actually achieve there?
Well, we clearly always hear the loud mouthpiece that is Donald Trump. I mean, he is literally always mouthing off about something, and many times Cuba just happens to fall out of his mouth in very aggressive and violent ways. But I would say that the real agenda holders behind this mouthpiece are a small minority of Cuban Americans. And I want to emphasize this: it's not Cuban Americans, but it's a small minority within the Cuban American community that have essentially, for decades, going back 6 decades essentially, have had a far right agenda to basically wage war on their own country in order to reclaim what they claim to have lost, which is absolute power, corruption, land, and resources that in Cuba belong to them as a small minority as well. And it's not uncommon, but it is one of the unique and particular cases of American politics where the whole the whole of a foreign policy of a country is basically held hostage by a minority that doesn't even share political interests with the U.S. elites. In fact, I would say that most U.S. elites throughout time have actually been favorable to U.S. relations with Cuba, but it's always been this tiny segment of a small community that have insisted that Cuba has to be blocked, that Cuba has to be taken over, when in fact, most policy experts in the US already recognize that the blockade, that this aggressive attitude towards Cuba just doesn't work. It has never managed to overthrow the Cuban Revolution.
Well, before we let you go, Manolo, I wanted to, bring it back to something you said in the beginning, which is that despite the, fuel blockade on the country and its very real impact in daily life, there's this creative resistance, which I think you write about a lot. You've covered this. Can you tell, for people who haven't been to Cuba, who maybe haven't been following, just some examples of what does creative resistance look like in a moment where the most powerful economy in the world is strangling your economy and also not allowing any fuel to come in? What does creative resistance mean in this moment in Cuba?
Well, creative resistance takes so many forms and ways in Cuba right now. I think part of it is like I just saw everywhere I went, solar panels going up. Cuba has really committed itself. I think not just because of the Trump fuel blockade. I mean, they were already building on this for the past 2 years, but it's definitely increasing its pace right now that there has to be a transition to renewable energy, not just because of these current conditions, but because Cuba does want to have a sustainable economy, wants to have a sustainable society. But I think the creative resistance also takes the form of so many doctors I met who, despite the horrible and difficult conditions, walk to work every day, sometimes for miles without end, um, pull 10 to 12 hour shifts, surgeons who are working literally with their cell phones lighting up the surgical room, basically saving lives against all odds. That's, to me, is creative resistance. But it's also the farmers. I've met a group of farmers who pooled some resources together to bring some of their produce collectively into the city, to be able to provide it and sell it to ordinary people. I mean, there's so many different stories about how Cubans are essentially trying to live normal lives despite the atrocity that is this fuel blockade.
Very powerful stuff. And Manolo, you and the People's Forum have organized a fundraiser actually to send solar panels to Cuba. Can you talk a little bit about that? What are the efforts ongoing and how can people support it?
Well, it's been, I would say, an extraordinary effort because we never imagined that thousands, at this point, tens of thousands of people in the United States would want to contribute to guaranteeing that Cuban hospitals could continue to function. And we've been amazed. We've, at this point, have raised over $500,000 from people across the United States and even people around the world who have contributed to this effort. And it's essentially going to try to maintain surgical rooms, particularly functioning in hospitals across the island of Cuba. And we're literally working as we speak right now to get those panels to the island. It's been an extraordinary effort with the support of so many people across the world and the United States. And we encourage people to keep donating because we want to continue expanding this reach so that we can impact the lives of so many, I would say, millions of Cubans. I mean, we heard when I was just there that at this point there are over 96,000 people who are online or waiting in queues to get surgeries and have not been able to do so because of the fuel shortages. So we want to be able to address that and continue to help Cuba save lives.
Well, Manolo, thank you so much for being with us here at Breakthrough News, and we will surely turn back to you for more updates from Cuba and, of course, all of the other places in the world that you're following very diligently. Thank you so much.
Thank you.